Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 14th of November and I'm Andrew Wilson. First of all, today on the Full Scottish, I'll have a coronavirus update for you. Then I'll introduce our two brilliant guests for today's programme, and then together we will discuss the top stories of the week from Scotland and around the world. As at 2 p.m. yesterday, Saturday, there were 3,052 new confirmed cases of COVID-19, and there have been 13 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. 4,326,637 people have received their first vaccination against the virus, and 3,924,305 people have received their second dose. 780 people were in hospital last night with confirmed COVID, 59 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 680,455 people in Scotland have tested positive for COVID-19, and 9,388 patients who had tested positive have sadly died in Scotland. Now, we're joined on the Full Scottish today by two brilliant guests, as I say. Firstly, we're joined by Sandra White. Sandra stood down or retired in May as the SNP MSP for Glasgow Kelvin, having served in our Parliament since 1999. Sandra, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm fine, Andrew. Looking forward to a nice chat and getting some points across.
Brilliant, and thank you for joining us today, Sandra. We really appreciate it. We're also joined today by Simon Barrow. Simon is director of the Edinburgh-based think tank Ecclesia, which looks at politics, ethics and belief. He's also a member of the NUJ and is on the SNP Trades Union Group. Simon, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm very well indeed. It's a bit dreich today, but it's going to be cheery in the studio.
Absolutely. It's brilliant of you to join us today, Simon, and it's great that you could be with us and with Sandra too. It'll be no surprise to anybody that the first item that we'll look at today is the World Leaders Summit and then the rest of the COP26 conference, which has been taking place in Glasgow for the last 2 weeks. I think you would have to have been locked on your own in an empty room not to be aware of the conference, given the extent and the depth of the coverage. But as you'll likely be aware, late last night, the Glasgow Climate Pact was signed and a final documented agreement was reached between the 197 countries who were present. And this morning we've seen Boris Johnson describe it as the beginning of the end of climate change. Al Gore has described the agreement as meaningful but not enough. And the European Commission's representative said that the agreement that was reached was an 18-carat gold agreement rather than a 24-carat gold agreement. And I think it's agreed widely that the real tasks start now. However, firstly, Sandra, if thinking of the way in which the Glasgow Climate Pact has been described by a number of people this morning, what sort of deal do you think has been done in the end at COP26?
I think it's disappointing. It was a great conference, don't get me wrong, and someone who lives in the merchant city certainly met a lot of brilliant people from various countries. The biggest disappointment, the first, I think, is the fact that we wanted it to be called emergency climate, which obviously they took it out and just said climate. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, which I think everyone is very aware of, is the biggest countries are the ones who are the biggest polluters, China and India, for instance. And to be able to basically say, take out phasing out and saying phasing down, I think that's a disappointment to a lot of people. They managed to get that wording changed, and that's where my concerns and various others' concerns come into it. But on the other side, a bright light, you might say, which has come in, is the fact that for the first time ever, they've recognised coal and actually mentioned it, and it's been recognised that coal is the biggest polluter. So I suppose that's a plus point. But on the minus point is, as Greta has said, talk, where is the action? That's what it's all about. But I think, the fact that coal has been mentioned, we need to put more pressure, particularly on China and India and these other countries which are the main polluters. And that's a disappointment for me. And I think a lot of folk felt disappointed in that respect.
That's a very good point that you make, Sandra. As you say, it's widely believed that it was interventions last night by China and India which resulted in the language in the agreement being watered down somewhat, as you say, from coal being phased out to being phased down. What do you think? It struck me that on the one hand it was predictable, on the other hand it was disappointing. What do you think the politics of that late intervention by India and China are going to be, both from a UK perspective and also from a global perspective?
Well, the politics are the knock-on effect. Obviously, China and India, as we said previously, particularly China, are one of the biggest polluters. So the politics is far-reaching for the world. Obviously, for the developed countries, as we may call them, in regards to the European Union, more pressure needs to be put on that. Are we going to see? I don't think they'll go as far as to put sanctions or anything. But when you're making deals with China and India, I think the fact of the coal and the emissions, I think that should come into it. Will it come into it from the politicians? That's another question we've got to ask. But I think there is a door open there that we can say, well, obviously this has come out of the climate summit that we had here in Glasgow, and therefore I think it could be used as a leverage when you're making any deals with or any pacts with China and India. And certainly I think that's the way we should be going. We should be using that, the fact that they've said, well, we're not saying it's definite, but it could be. We should be pushing that. And I think that's the danger is the politics is that people will go back into their bunkers and won't do anything about it. But you have an opportunity to open these doors with this wording of coal being, spoke about and actually being written down and mentioned. And I think that's an important aspect of it.
Thanks, Sandra. And Simon, the First Minister made a statement late last night. She said the Glasgow Climate Pact does not contain everything that every country wanted, and there is understandable disappointment that key issues were watered down in the final hours, but there can be no doubt that the Glasgow summit has made progress on some important issues. The importance of capping temperature increases at 1.5 degrees is no longer questioned, and the need for countries to come back next year with higher contributions to tackling emissions may be just enough to keep 1.5 alive, if countries, including Scotland, really do deliver on our commitments. And she finished, where COP26 has succeeded, the pressure from young people, the Global South and activists around the world has been critical. Where COP has more to do, it is leaders who must shoulder the responsibility. So, Simon, what struck you with regard to the First Minister's summarising of the event of the last 2 weeks' events, and in particular the role that, as she put it, young people, the Global South, and activists have had in reaching the agreement that was signed last night?
Well, I think obviously the role that activists have played has been enormously important. The role the First Minister has played has been very good as well, and she's clearly trying to be optimistic about it. But I'm afraid the situation we face is much darker than this. And I also want to say that making India and China the targets misses the point completely. So let's start at the beginning and say that we arrived at COP26 in a situation where, for the large part, the richest countries and richest corporations in the world had not met their targets from Paris. And we're still in a situation where, rather than holding global warming to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, we're heading for possibly as high as 2 or 2.2 on current promises. And that's absolutely disastrous. And any attempt by Boris Johnson, Alok Sharma, the US, or anybody else to pretend otherwise is, I'm afraid, missing the point. The thing about China and India is that they contain around about 3 billion of the world's nearly 8 billion population. And if you look at it by head of population, they are not the largest polluters. They're also taking, particularly China, taking pretty drastic action. They've been slow to get into the game, but they are in the game. The whole thing about coal, of course, is part of the politics of it, because the people who really need to move are the US, the EU, Australia, Canada, the big corporations, and particularly the military, who pumped in 750 million tonnes of toxic waste last year and are amongst the biggest polluters. When we see movement from them, then I think you will see more movement from China and from India. And India particularly needs support in making those kinds of moves. But really, it's naked politics at the moment. Let's blame China and let's blame India. But that really is missing it. There are a number of things that need to happen, which the activists have been pressing for, which aren't happening at the moment. We need the 100 billion of public finance for debt and redress, which was published by 2020, hasn't been delivered, is a tiny fraction of the money that was pumped in to prop up the global economy after the crash in 2008. We need goals for global adaptation, clear goals and financial targets attached to those. We need the Santiago network on loss and delay actually implemented by the next COP. We need emission radiation targets. We also need to move away from just talking about net zero. Net zero is about, okay, well, there's a certain amount of damage which will balance by doing good stuff, but offsetting carbon markets, carbon capture technologies, geoengineering, all of that's a con. It's not good enough. We actually need to be looking at zero. So, and fundamentally, we need just transition. And I can say that at the SNP conference in November, I and the trade union group have put down a motion on actually measuring targets for just transition in terms of jobs, which we hope will get onto the final agenda and is very important. Scotland can play a key part, but no, COP26 isn't nearly enough, and the activists are right to point that out.
Absolutely. Thanks, Simon. It struck me during the conference and in particular this weekend that as we've heard, a number of important issues weren't really covered or weren't really tabled, and in a sense, as you were rightly saying, the naked politics and the communication of naked politics has boiled complex and wide-ranging issues down to perhaps a handful of issues which are more easily explainable or communicable. So do you think in terms of the way in which the conference has been positioned and has played out, do you think it's been constructive and helpful to try and simplify and reduce complex issues and complex interconnected issues which go much more widely than, as you say, simply net carbon zero? Do you think it's been helpful to boil these issues down? Has that been done to try and perhaps to inject a little bit more positive energy into the conference rather than standing around worrying about the size and scale of the issues, or has that simplification and that boiling down has that underplayed the seriousness of what we're facing together?
Well, I think as
sorry, I didn't know who it was directed to, but the point I wanted to make was when we're talking about politics, it will come down to, unfortunately, the naked politics of the biggest polluters and obviously capitalism when you come to America and these other states as well. But the point Simon made, I thought really, really interesting, and it comes in what you said, Andrew, as well. We didn't get down to the nitty gritty that really affects people such as in the Amazon and other areas, and the fact that we in the West send our waste to these other countries. I would rather have saw more attention paid to that, and in fact to the capitalism which is involved, and the fact that we are actually a big part of the problem by sending our waste and basically to these other countries. And I'd rather have saw that come into it rather than just the naked politics which we mentioned at the beginning.
Absolutely, thanks, Sandra, and Simon, for you as well. Has the simplification and the boiling down of the wide-ranging and very deep issues that are facing humanity, has that helped or has it hindered the communication of these issues during COP26?
Well, obviously, when it gets to reaching agreement, the devil is in the detail, and that needs to be looked at, and that's what the conference is there to do. In terms of public presentation of it, As Sandra was just saying, the difficulty is that, we do need to understand things in headline terms, but often there's a lot of politics in this. And that, of course, is because huge players in COP26 were actually the major polluters, the major corporations, the oil and gas companies, and so on. They were massively represented in it. Whereas indigenous people from the developing world, whose homes are going to disappear, whose lives are literally under threat, were not adequately represented in any way, and weren't fully represented in the central discussions. That's absolutely disgraceful and has to change. Still, the whole process of dealing with climate change has been hijacked by the companies that have the biggest investment in it and the countries that have the biggest investment in it. And as I say, this isn't a question of letting China and India off the hook, but it is a question of recognizing that per head of population, they are not the largest polluters. And we have to deal with the people who really have the money and the technical capability to address these questions. So it does come down to the question of neoliberal capitalism and the kind of economic system we have at the moment, which is literally leading to the destruction of the planet and which has to change. But I think the good thing I want to end on is that we have seen points in history after wars with the Marshall Plan and so on, the vast amount of quantitative easing that took place during the financial crash, which dwarfs some of the sums of money being talked about at COP. We can make major adjustments, and that's what we really have to look at. So those major adjustments, those headline issues, are the ones that need to come into focus, but obviously the details of the negotiation get into the minutiae.
Thanks, Simon. We'll move on to our next item now, and that really is the beginning of touching on what Sandra just described as naked politics. We know that in the last week or so, it's been reported in Scotland that the Centre for the somewhat unknown Centre for Economic Education and Training was found to have given £46,000 to the pressure group Scotland Matters in the run-up to the Scottish election in May 21, and that's a problem because the Centre for Economic Education and Training was not registered with the Electoral Commission and therefore was not entitled to be making donations like that. And that comes against the background in previous years of the Scottish Unionist Association Trust being fined for its donation of £364,000 and also the Irvine Unionist Club having been fined for its donation of £100,000. And then as the week went on, what I've described earlier this week as the ripple effect from following the Owen Paterson affair has continued, and now we found that we found yesterday that Douglas Ross has forgotten to declare £28,000 of income and has referred himself to the Westminster regulator. So, Sandra, for you, first of all, in the case of Douglas Ross and in the case of the dark money flowing into unionist campaigns, are we seeing more examples here of Douglas Ross and others thinking that the rules just don't apply to them?
I think when it comes to Westminster politics, they've always thought the rules don't apply to them. To be able to buy houses, rent houses out, have second jobs, not put in the money, get contracts because you've got a friend or a relative in the Westminster government. It's took a long, long time for this to make headlines. And to be frank, for the media actually to report it, they have no option now because so many people are being made aware of it. And I really, pay tribute to the individuals who look into this and put it on Twitter, Facebook, etc. because for years this has been going on, years and years, taxpayers' money, getting away with it. Basically, I hate to use the words putting two fingers up, but that's what they do. If you're an ordinary person and you happen to make a mistake, you can be arrested, jailed, fined. They seem to get away with everything. And I'm pleased it's coming out just now, but it's been on for far too long. As an elected member, I had to put in tax returns every year. I had an accountant, paid for an accountant, put in tax returns every single year. You can't just forget about the fact you've got a second, or in Douglas Ross's case, a third job. It shouldn't be allowed that people should even have another job when they're basically got a full-time job as an MSP or an MP. It's a disgraceful situation. And I'm just pleased that people out there in the streets are starting to see just how corrupt Westminster is. And I know we're going to go on to talk about the House of Lords as another corrupt place, but I just find it unbelievable that it's took all this time for the general media to actually start to hold Westminster and the elected members there, not all of them obviously, to account. And I think they should all be investigated and charged if they've been seen to, in my eyes, commit fraud.
Thanks, Sandra. We will come on to the House of Lords next, I promise, and we'll deal with that one as well. But Simon, as we found out yesterday, Douglas Ross didn't record in the Commons Register of Interest significant sums from his second job as a List MSP, and his third job as a football linesman. And the SNP's Rona Mackay has said recently Ross laughably claimed that the Tories are the party of the working class in Scotland, yet apparently he can't keep tabs on a wedge of extra earnings, which are significantly more than the year's pay for the average Scot. So there's a number of elements in that, but one thing that certainly struck me over the last 48 hours is the amounts of money that we're talking about here. As Rona Mackay rightly points out, the amount of additional extra income that Douglas Ross has apparently forgotten to disclose is more than the average Scot earns in a year. Do you think this is an indication that our politicians of all colours are becoming more and more detached? And I'll add to that, we've seen calls from Westminster parliamentarians for their salaries to be increased, saying that they cannot afford to live on the £81,000 that they are paid as a backbench MP every year. So, Simon, do you think this is an indication that our politicians are becoming more and more remote from the reality of the lives of the voters, or is it just the case that that's always been the case and this is just a reminder of the case?
Well, I think it's a dangerous situation when we start to get into a discourse that says, oh, all MPs are at it, all MPs are corrupt, etc. That's not the case. There are many very hardworking MPs, and I know some of them personally. This is a particular problem with the Tory party more than anywhere else. And again, it's difficult for the BBC and broadcast and others to say that, but that's absolutely the case. And it is part of a wider systemic problem. On the question of increasing salaries and so on, I think being an MP must be the only job where, when there are issues of corruption, the solution is actually to increase the amount of money that you have, rather than, for example, sending you to jail for corruption, which is what happens in other industrial and commercial sectors. It's a quite extraordinary discourse to get into. And as Sandra has said, the way ordinary people are treated is entirely differently. It's noticeable that Douglas Ross, who himself has said, he's raised questions about MPs having two jobs while he himself has three jobs, and he did forget a sum of money involving over £28,000, but he didn't forget at all to go and vote to cut the benefits of the poorest people in the country. And that's true also for all the MPs, the Tory MPs, who tripped through the lobbies to vote after Owen Paterson had been caught out to try and actually change the rules and make legal what actually should be illegal. So this is systematic corruption. I mean, at Ecclesia, we have a massive file on this, and it gets longer and longer by the day. And it's great that Open Democracy and the Good Law Project and the Ferret and others, independent media outlets, those who are actually involved in the question of legal scrutiny, are bringing this to the public attention, but the media hasn't done nearly enough, and we absolutely need to address it. And of course, we're going to come on to the Lords, but that's another dimension of the problem. I think the last comment I'd make about it is that it's, as far as this UK government is concerned, it's part of a pattern. Not only are they relying on dark money and quite happy for that to fund their party and to fund their activities, but also there are attempts to restrain the activities of the Electoral Commission. There's been the willingness of Johnson and others to prorogue Parliament, to bypass Parliament completely in terms of key decisions, to try and fix the boundaries for elections. What we're seeing is a major threat to democracy across the UK. And the question of corruption and the question of dark money needs to be addressed as part of an awareness of that wider issue.
Thanks, Simon. We'll come back to what I will describe in a moment. So when we touch on it, as what might be regarded as Johnson's apparently Nixonian approach to those who would seek to regulate and control his power. We'll come back to that in a little while. However, you rightly mentioned both you and Sandra mentioned the House of Lords, and we'll touch on and we'll look at that now because. As I've described during the week, what started with the Owen Paterson affair then turned into then rippled out and has begun to touch a number of interrelated issues. And as you say, Simon, which certainly runs the risk of attempting, for nefarious reasons, I would say, to paint all politicians with the same brush, whereas it's much more clearly the case that it's a subset of politicians and, as you say, predominantly Tory politicians who are breaking the rules, who are in order to raise money, and are now coming under scrutiny and are seeking to change the way in which parliamentarians their conduct is scrutinised. So we'll look at that now. Sandra, there's a tradition, I think now it's recognised that those who donate more than £3 million to the Conservative Party are made treasurer of the party temporarily and then are put into the House of Lords. This has been described as a scandal in plain sight, and it struck me that if you are donating such significant amounts of money to a political party, then in the nature of donations of that size, it's likely that you're looking for something in return for your donation. So with regard to what we've been hearing with regard to these significant amounts of money, I think £54 million in total donated to the Conservative Party by people who have ended up in the House of Lords. Do you think that this indicates that there needs to be, Sandra, do you think this indicates that there needs to be a reform of the system or a reform of the House of Lords?
Not a reform of the House of Lords, just get rid of it as far as I'm concerned. It's the most undemocratic so-called legislator. I think it's the size of it, nearly 800 peers there, second only none to China, basically. I certainly would abolish it. These people have not been elected, as you mentioned, particularly under the Tories, recently under Boris Johnson. If you donate enough to the Tory party, you're made a peer. Hardly any of them have voted at all, bother to even turn up half the time. I think that's as corrupt as Simon has previously said. It is a crime that these people are paying to basically get into the House of Lords, and if they have a particular interest, then they can sway any policies that go through. If they're using the House of Lords as a second chamber, I would completely abolish it. I don't think there's anything democratic about this huge big chamber of nearly 800 members being put in there under political party patronage. And that is really what it boils down to, the sheer patronage of it. And when we're talking about democracy, I don't see anything democratic in that at all, in that regards. If you're a politician standing for election, you have to declare all of the monies that comes to you if you're standing for election. And there's no way that as an individual who would be standing, I could get over, £1 million or £10,000. It just isn't allowed in the rules. But there seems to be one rule for one, once again, and one rule for another. And the Tories in particular have really used this undemocratic way to place people in to the House of Lords who will do their bidding. And also, obviously, it works the other way. If they basically give monies to the Tory party, then basically they will expect something back, which is a peerage, but not just a peerage. If they still get interest in their businesses, which a number of them have, then they will be looking for something that's sympathetic to them. It's completely corrupt, completely undemocratic. And once again, it shows you just what a particular state our so-called government in Westminster, and I'm not talking about a particular government, I'm talking about the fact of Westminster is just completely unsuitable, and the House of Lords in particular shows that to be a case in point.
Thanks, Sandra. You're absolutely right. I went and checked this morning, and the parliamentary website is delightfully vague, saying that there are around 800 members of the House of Lords. There isn't a number. I think it's been partially because it's been going up so quickly recently under Boris Johnson. But the point you make is there are about 800 peers. There are 650 MPs. The House of Lords is larger than the Supreme People's Assembly of North Korea and is beaten in size only by the Chinese National People's Congress. And that compares to the United States, where there are 100 senators. France has 348 senators. And in India, there are 250 members of the upper house. Whereas, in contrast, Scotland, the Scottish Parliament doesn't have an upper house. And our near neighbours, Norway, Finland and Denmark, they don't have an upper house either. So the point you make is absolutely right, Sandra. But Simon, turning to you now, thinking again about the issue of conflicts of interest and the impact upon that which money, I'll put it in those terms, can have. Thinking of those who it's been identified this week are being paid significant sums of money by private interests while also serving in the House of Commons. Without picking on anyone in particular, Simon, would you pay Chris Grayling £100,000 a year if he wasn't sitting in the House of Commons?
Well, I think anyone would be questioning paying money to Chris Grayling, who seems to failing Grayling as he gets nicknamed wherever he goes. But leaving the individuals aside, it seems to me that the only second jobs that should be allowed for politicians at Westminster are those that are involved in public service. There are a number of MPs who do some work in the health service and so on. They also work incredibly hard and well beyond reasonable expectation of hours in their parliamentary work as well. But commercial interests should not be allowed. But I mean, returning to the question of the House of Lords, I agree very much with the comments that Sandra's made. It seems to me to get to the heart of the problem with the system. Let's remember, incidentally, that the most controversial appointment that was made was that of Peter Cruddas to the House of Lords, who was given a title after Boris Johnson specifically rejected the advice of the House of Lords Appointments Commission. Mm-hmm. So it goes that deep, the problem. I agree that the House of Lords should disappear. I mean, it's worth saying that people have been talking in the Westminster Parliament about the reform of the House of Lords for about 100 years. And although some changes have been made, it's still there. It will still remain there until the first past the post system and the domination of just two unrepresentative parties goes as well. But what that says to you is that the whole system needs changing. And of course, my perspective is that the United Kingdom as a polity has had its day. What we need to see instead is independence for Scotland and for independent nations to work together in a more confederal kind of arrangement. So it seems to me that the problem is far more fundamental. But within the current system, what needs to happen is that the House of Lords should be abolished and replaced with a chamber which perhaps represents the regions, perhaps represent civil society. I think bicameral systems, have something in favour of them. But this is simply cronyism under another name, and it's reflected both in the House of Lords and unfortunately in the House of Commons. And I think the difficulty here, and we mentioned particularly the Conservative Party, it's within the DNA of the Conservative Party to stand for wealth, power and privilege. And it will always, at the end of the day, whilst trying to put on the clothes of being the party of working people, which is a joke really, operate in those terms. And that power and that monopoly of wealth on the democratic system, which undermines democracy, needs to be challenged.
Thanks, Simon. Now we'll move on to the next item today, and that is that we learned last night that Richard Ratcliffe, who has been on hunger strike outside Downing Street for the past 19 days, has finally ended his hunger strike. And has walked away, as is described in the media this morning, has walked away with his held head high after receiving huge support across the media and from politicians in support for his campaign to seek the release and the repatriation to the United Kingdom of his wife Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who has been held as a prisoner in Tehran for several years now. And so whilst his latest campaign has not proved successful in moving the British government to do anything to obtain his wife's release and return from Tehran, and we learned in particular of how downcast Mr. Ratcliffe was following a meeting with the Foreign Secretary at the end of last week, at which it became apparent that nothing else was going to be done. His hunger strike has brought attention back once more to the plight of his wife and his family. He has a young daughter, a 7-year-old daughter, who's living with him and has been living with friends whilst he's been on hunger strike. And the events leading up to the background to this story and the background to Ms. Zaghari Ratcliffe being imprisoned in Tehran have been described this morning as another disgrace to shame this shameless government. But Sandra, turning to you first. In 2016, the United States government settled a $400 million bill, a debt owed to the Iranian government, and shortly thereafter, 4 US citizens who were being detained in Tehran were repatriated to the USA. And when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, it is reported that he promised personally to Richard Ratcliffe that the £400 million debt, which is owed by the UK government to Tehran, but which has not been paid, Boris Johnson promised Richard Ratcliffe personally that the payment would be made, but it has not. So, do you think Sandra? Do you think this indicates that that there's nothing in it for the British government, so they just don't care, or is it that there is something else at play here, which means that they are apparently unable and unwilling, most importantly unwilling, to do anything to pursue the release of Miss Zaghari Ratcliffe and return her to the UK safe and sound?
I mean, I think we must remember this came about because the incompetent Boris Johnson at a meeting in Iran mentioned that Mrs. Ratcliffe was a journalist. That's where it all started from, apparently, and she was accused of spying, etc., as we know. I mean, you think about, we've just spoken about second jobs, money's going here and there, corruption in the Westminster government. You wouldn't believe a single word that comes out of Boris Johnson's mouth. If he promises you anything, you need to look in your back pocket to make sure your wallet was still there. There is nothing that man says that you can actually believe in. It's a drop in the ocean, the money that they owe to Iran, and they should be paying it right now. I don't think there is anything underneath this, anything suspicious about the fact that if they pay that money, something else will come out. I think it's just Boris Johnson and the Tory party at large are not willing to admit they have made a mistake. They're not willing to come to terms with the fact that Boris Johnson was the one that instigated Mrs. Ratcliffe's imprisonment. And we've got to remember, I think this is the third time she's been brought to court, and then she'd be imprisoned even more. So this could have been sorted out, at the very beginning, and it's been dragging on and dragging on and dragging on. And the poor Mrs. Ratcliffe, it must be horrendous what she's going through, and her husband, who had to go on hunger strike as well. I think it's just blatant. Put your head in the sand, stamp your feet. This is coming, from Westminster, from Boris Johnson. We will not give in to these demands type thing. I think that's what they're playing at. I don't think there's anything suspicious otherwise, that could come out of it. I think it's the fact that Boris Johnson in particular is an incompetent nincompoop, and basically he will not step down and say, oh, sorry, I made a mistake, sorry, I said this and I said that, and they're just burying their head in the sand and basically thinking, oh, eventually it'll go away. And it's an absolute disgrace, and I'm sorry that Mr. Ratcliffe had to go on hunger strike, or any of them had to go through this, but we need to put pressure on the UK government. And I think there's a debate, isn't it? Is it tomorrow is a debate in the House of Commons? We should be calling during that debate for the heads of the Westminster government, for the heads of the Tory government, to ensure that that lady is actually brought back and that money is paid.
Thanks, Sandra. And Simon, it certainly is the case that during this latest hunger strike, Johnson has not engaged at all with the protest, and Richard Ratcliffe is reported as thinking that that is a conspicuous dereliction of duty on the Prime Minister's part. He says that Johnson has hidden away in the circumstances. I find that remarkable. And there's been widespread criticism of what has been described as a flailing and ill-led Foreign Office. However, to look at Johnson again for a moment, I would argue that Johnson is perhaps the most intensely transactional Prime Minister we've had for many, many years. It has often struck me that he is motivated to act only when there is something in it for him. And certainly on thinking about it, it struck me that in that respect, at least, he is very similar to Donald Trump in terms of the transactional nature of policy and implementation of policy. And so, do you think is it fair or accurate to describe Johnson in those very transactional terms? And if it is fair, do you think that holds out any hope at all that Ms. Zaharie Ratcliffe her case is going to be addressed seriously? The debt to Tehran is going to be paid, and there's a chance that she might be brought home to be reunited with her young daughter and her husband.
Well, of course, as Sandra has just said, the situation has arisen in the first place because of the bungling and incompetence of Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary. So he has a personal debt in this matter. He certainly is a transactional and calculating politician. I think I saw on social media yesterday that someone from the media was sort of saying he's managed to con us into thinking he's smart, but he's not. Actually, he's managed to con us into thinking he's stupid, and he's not. He's actually a really calculating kind of politician. I mean, he's also reckless, lazy, and incompetent in various ways, but we shouldn't write him off as daft. Now, a lot of this is also caught up in the politics of the Foreign Office at the moment, and the debt that we've talked about, £400 million to Tehran, it dates back to the 1970s. It's now been acknowledged as a precondition for the release of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who of course has been in prison now for around about 2,000 days. I mean, it's just absolutely awful. It's appalling that Iran and other regimes throughout the world, effectively take hostages for other political and commercial purposes. We shouldn't deny that. But the fact is that a number of courts have ruled that the British government does owe this money and it should be paid. The excuse for not paying it is really twofold. One is we shouldn't be giving in to bribery. Well, that's a bit rich from a government that engages in bribery in all kinds of other ways. And secondly, we can't do it because it goes against sanctions against Iran. But actually, the debt predates the sanctions against Iran. And I don't think there's anyone else in the world who would say that it would be wrong to meet that financial obligation and to free not just Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, but also other people who are being held in detention, not as high profile, not being noticed in the same way. So I think there absolutely has to be action. Hopefully there will be much more pressure. I mean, Richard, Nazarin's husband, has been absolutely heroic in the way that he has dealt with this. And I think we should also put out a word too for his MP, the Labour MP Tulip Siddiq. She and others across all parties have worked really hard to highlight this case, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. Action needs to be taken, and once again, we're talking about corruption as an element in the politics that we're dealing with here.
Absolutely, thanks, Simon. And as you rightly point out, in the case of the US settlement of their debt with Tehran, in order to deal with the legal challenges that they were concerned might be put forward to a large payment being made through the banking system to Tehran, to get around that, the United States settled the debt in cash. They sent a container full of dollars to Tehran. Indeed. And settled it that way. One other thing, and it struck me also, whether or not Johnson is a transactional politician, it certainly struck me that in common with many politicians, he is very finely attuned to communicating in a way and communicating to his base. Now, it struck me that Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe and also Anousheh Ashouri and Morad Tabaz, all three ladies who are in custody in Tehran, they're dual nationals and they have foreign-sounding names. Now, do you think that might in some way have had an impact or an effect on the way in which Boris Johnson, when he was Foreign Secretary and now still as Prime Minister, and also Liz Truss as Foreign Secretary now, do you think insofar as these three ladies would not, as I say, are dual nationals and have foreign-sounding names which are difficult for readers of the Daily Mail to pronounce, perhaps, do you think that has had an effect on the way in which they have been treated by this Conservative government?
Well, I didn't know if Simon
Sorry.
was coming in or not.
Yeah.
I seem to butt in constantly all the time.
Go on, Sandra.
I was actually going to come in that particular point. When the Tories obviously won the election, that was won on the back of racism and immigration. And it goes back to that. They copied Farage, and unfortunately the Labour Party did also, to win votes. And when I say that they're sticking their head in the sand and they're standing firm, such as the politics comes into that, because in their little world, stopping people from coming to this country, that's a vote winner for them. You mentioned these three women, dual national, foreign sounding names, as they say. Now, they see that as a defeat. I'm almost certain the Tories would see that as a defeat if they pay this money to allow these people to get out. And that plays well with the Daily Mail readers, and obviously the people, the Tories, are wanting to vote for them. And I think there's something in that, Andrew, that you had mentioned.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sandra. Simon, what we'll do is I'll come to you with the next topic instead, if I may, because it has a direct relationship to part of your work, and that is that there concerns have been raised about the composition of the panel which will decide the new chair of the media regulator, Ofcom. Former Tory advisor Michael Simmons, who's the husband of the Schools Minister Nick Gibb and therefore the brother-in-law of the BBC board member and former Number 10 Communications Chief Robbie Gibb, will now sit on the interview panel which will decide which applicants meet the required criteria to head the organisation. And he'll be joining the lobbyist Michael Prescott, who works at Hanover Communications, a company with close connections to the Conservative Party. Now, on Thursday, John Nicholson MP said, Ofcom plays a huge and important role as a media regulator. The new online safety bill will give it significant powers. However, it needs to have teeth, it needs to be independent, and it needs to be seen to be independent. He continued, this UK government has become synonymous with sleaze and backroom deals. Voters are tired of it. They want public officials chosen for their competence and professionalism, not their connections to Downing Street. He finished, voters want transparency, not chumocracy. So Simon, what do you think the prospects for the media in the United Kingdom and the wider social media, considering the increased role that Ofcom will have, what do you think the prospects for the media and social media will be in the UK in the event that Downing Street gets its way and Paul Dacre becomes the chairman of the regulator?
Well, yes. I mean, that's a big question. Let's start with the specifics of Ofcom, which, of course, is the regulator that handles all communications in terms of both regulation and competition. So you're talking about TV, radio, video on demand, fixed line telecoms, mobile, etc. Portal communications and so on. So it will have increased powers. It's extremely important. The idea that it would be headed up by Paul Dacre seems to me roughly equivalent to putting Frankenstein in charge of human resources or something like that. I mean, it's appalling, really, given his record and the record of his newspaper. And there was an attempt to get him through in May. There was an attempt to get him through in October. The rules have been rewritten. There are all the questions that you have articulated about the independence of the process. And again, this is seeping corruption and very, very dangerous for press freedom as well. But it's part of a wider picture. We also have IPSO, the so-called Independent Press Standards Organisation, which is actually, of course, in hock to the newspaper industry. We have, I mean, a number of people are now regulated by Impress, the Independent Monitor for the Press, which actually is an independent organisation, but doesn't have nearly enough powers. So it's part of a wider pattern. And of course, behind that also is the fact that six billionaires, six corporations own the vast majority of the broadcasting and print media in the United Kingdom. And that's extremely dangerous and extremely unbalanced. We need a vibrant, diverse press and broadcast media, and also online media that reflects a range of interests and viewpoints, not the domination of the whole system by corporate interests, who are also, of course, tied once again to the Conservative Party. And Paul Dacre has been a strong supporter of the right of the Conservative Party. His newspaper has pumped out propaganda about Europe for years. It's pumped out propaganda against migrants, asylum seekers, refugees. You know, it has a disproportionate interest, and it certainly shouldn't be the newspaper that has its former editor as head of a body that's supposed to be actually regulating our communications and dealing with conflicts of interest and dealing with competition.
Thank you, Simon. Now then, as an appetizer for our final item today, what we'll do now is that we have a short clip, or we have a clip of a short interview with the First Minister, which was made by our friends at the CNN affiliate N1 in Bosnia earlier this week. We've been assisting N1 with their production whilst they've been covering COP26. So we'll have a quick look at that clip of the interview now.
First Minister, you have shown such great leadership when it comes to taking the world through COP, and you have shown it from every day, from day one to today, the 7th day of COP. Why is it important for Scotland to show the world, hey, this is what we can do, this is how we can do it, and this is the example that you can follow in order to reach all those ambitious goals that are set here at COP?
Well, first and foremost, you know, Scotland is the location for this COP, so practically, logistically, we, in partnership with the UN and the UK government, have a responsibility to make sure it goes smoothly and all of the conditions are right for the political discussions to be successful. But more generally, you know, Scotland is a developed country. Scotland, Glasgow, where COP is happening, led the world into the Industrial Revolution. We have benefited for, you know, decades, centuries now from the emissions that are causing climate change. So we've got a massive responsibility now to lead by example in tackling climate change, and in particular to help those countries that are on the front line of the effects of climate change but have done so little to cause it, adapt and mitigate in future. So there's a moral responsibility on the shoulders of countries like Scotland, and it's really important that we live up to that.
There we go, and thanks to our friends and colleagues at N1 for the time that they spent with us and with working with us during COP26. Now, Sandra, I'll turn to you. I think it's fair to say that Scotland's First Minister has had a pretty positive couple of weeks on the world stage during COP26, winning key awards for her climate action, being declared a true leader in the room by one expert, and speaking to a global audience in international interviews like the one we just saw. It's hard to deny that in some senses she may have stolen the show. She met Greta Thunberg and Vanessa Nakati on day one. There was the success of funding the COP26 Youth Conference. She was photographed meeting and receiving a gift from Joe Biden. She then received the Ray of the Day award for doing something exceptional to move negotiations forward. She was declared the true leader of COP26 by one of the other delegates. And then, of course, there were the CNN interview with Christiane Amanpour, which compared. It was night and day in comparison to the interview that the Prime Minister gave to Christiane Amanpour the following day. So, Sandra, what do you think the outcome for Nicola Sturgeon has been as a result of her participation and all of the work she's put in during COP26?
I'll say a Scottish or a Glasgow comment. She's played an absolute blinder, basically. I think she's done a magnificent job. She's put Glasgow and Scotland right there at the top. She shows she's competent. She's represented as a First Minister, the Scottish Government, the Scottish people. She hasn't put a foot wrong. And we were talking about the media earlier, and you mentioned, Andrew, about the youth conference. we should be reminding, and the media should have been saying this as well, that the UK government refused to fund that, youth conference. It was the Scottish government that put the money up to fund that, and that was fantastic, but didn't get as much coverage, the fact that the UK government refused to fund it. But she met all of these people. There was coverage everywhere. I think she did an absolutely fantastic job. And when I saw some of the comments from the Spectator, the Telegraph, some Labour politicians, lots of Tory politicians, it was just absolutely petty, absolutely petty. They were saying these things that basically, well, she shouldn't have been there. Well, she was there. She'd done a fantastic job. She didn't go stumbling up steps and being drunk, which was allegedly. Boris Johnson was drunk when he stumbled up the steps. And she carried out every engagement with professionalism which is expected of a leader of a country. And I must admit, I was very impressed by particularly the women, who came forward and spoke, particularly the folk from the Marshall Islands and the indigenous people as well. They spoke passionately, as the First Minister did, and articulately as well. I think she had a fantastic conference, and I was so pleased to see the fact that Glasgow in Scotland was on the map. And Boris Johnson, for all the Tories tried to get her out of the picture, was basically nowhere to be seen. And when he was there, it was just a shambling mess.
Thanks, Sandra. Yes, the Prime Minister's continuing performance, I'm sure, is something that we're going to return to with both of our guests on Reporting Scotland. However, that is the last news item that we're going to discuss today. We're only able to make these programmes on Broadcasting Scotland with your financial support. If you are able to support us with a donation or a subscription, then you will be helping Broadcasting Scotland to do more. And so the details of how to do that are on the screen now, and I can certainly encourage you to help us if it is possible for you to do so. I'd like also to say thank you to Sandra White and to Simon Barrow for their time and contributions today. Thank you both, guys.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you very much. And if the First Minister is watching, please join the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance and move the SNP to be the party of transition away from oil. I think that's really, really important. Had a great COP, but that's what we need to do.
You've got the plug in there, Simon. Well done. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'd like to say thank you to our two guests. I'd like to say thanks also to everyone who's watching today. We will be back tomorrow evening at 7 with Scotland at 7. So please join us then. Meantime, I hope that you've enjoyed a really tasty full Scottish today. Please keep warm and keep well. Bye-bye.